Is
No, it's
there
all good.
like a certain window we're talking about? Like we should be eating protein every 3 hours, every 4 hours, 5 hours? Like what's kind of that general rule of thumb that's
Yeah.
has it been
So
concluded, I should say.
there are some rough figures that would suggest like the muscle full effect, the refractory period lasts like 3 hours after maximally stimulating it. So that might indicate what's the maximal frequency that you'd want to eat, or that you'd want to consume protein, which would be like if you didn't sleep, 8 meals a day, and while you're awake would be like 5 or 6 meals a day if you think about it. But here's the thing, and this is that big caveat, Jeff, of the translational research, the applied long-term research where we actually look at changes in body composition, don't match those tracer studies. And that's because these tracer studies are done in a very sanitized environment. Like, for example, there's a classic study by Arita and colleagues where only thing these folks consume for the majority of a day, this is like a 16-hour study if I recall correctly, is 80 grams of whey protein. So for one, whey protein is by far the fastest digested protein, like
Right.
multiple times faster than actual things you eat. And it's also the only thing they consumed. No lipids, no dietary fat, no fiber, no
That was going to
carbohydrate.
be my
all
next
these,
question. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, all these things that slow down digestion. And they change not only they had changed the rate of appearance of amino acids in the blood, which only has a loose relationship with the process of muscle protein synthesis. So in reality, these, hey, you want to spike it every, like 3 hours. What's happening in the real world is you kind of have these very broad hills and very shallow valleys, because it's really only when you wake up first thing in the morning that you actually have a period where you don't have, exogenous amino acids present in your system that could have an impact on muscle protein synthesis. And that's probably why, Jeff, the data on actual long-term outcomes suggests, when we look at some of the studies on time-restricted feeding, which mimic the intermittent fasting crowd's practices, that there are some hints that you might get worse outcomes in terms of hypertrophy or body composition outcomes like muscle retention while dieting when you have fewer than 3 meals a day in a shorter time window. Like there's a study where they only had like a 4-hour feeding window. But once you get to that point where you're eating at least 3 meals per day, roughly evenly spreading out your protein, resistance training also occurs in the fed rather than the fasted state, which is how some of the most successful intermittent fasting studies, where they have not been outperformed by the non-intermittent fasting group, is what they do is they, at the start of their 8-hour window and the end, they have a meal, and they have one meal in the middle, or at least a protein feeding like whey, and they do that, then they work out. So if you're training in an amino acid available state, in the fed state, and you've got 3 meals, even if it's over just an 8-hour out of the 24-hour, out of the day, over at least like 8 to 12 week studies, it doesn't seem to have an impact. It might have a slightly negative impact if we're talking like 6-month periods. And there was one recently published study that looked at, I think, at a full year of intermittent fasting that suggested it might not quite be optimal. So generally, the recommendation is, hey, at least 3 meals a day is probably the bottom threshold. And we probably don't want to be going above 6 based on some data I've seen in terms of what might have a negative impact on hunger. Unless we're in the off season, then, hey, if it makes you more hungry, great. Like we're trying to get a lot of calories in, unless you're someone who is sedentary, doesn't have to eat a lot to gain weight, and your natural state is, I gain weight too quickly and I need to slow it down, which is actually quite common. So anyway, I know that was kind of long-winded, but that's just an important thing, because sometimes people will only be looking at the amino acid studies, and they'll be like, hey, we need to have a moderately high meal frequency to maximize MPS, and they ignore the longitudinal stuff. And they don't realize how weak the relationships are with MPS, just because it's a really fickle, acute measurement. It's good for understanding theory, but it's not translational research. Or some people will just be focused on the whole, stoke the metabolism thing as a myth. I was eating 8 meals a day and feeling terrible, and now I switched to IF, and 2 meals a day is great. And like that's wonderful. And yes, that was a myth, and it did create these very restrictive habits where you can't leave the home for more than 3 hours without bringing a cooler with you. But that doesn't mean there isn't some lower bounds where having at least a modicum of frequent meals, like 3 per day, isn't probably a good idea if your explicit goal is maximizing muscle mass gaining or retention of it during a diet. So yeah, and honestly, 3 to 6 meals a day should cover like most scenarios. It's rare that someone is like, three is way too much, or I need more than six, unless they have like a GI issue or some very strange work hours. And in that case, then sure, I think their situation will take precedence over what the data might suggest is slightly better,
I mean, someone listening to this who's like maybe someone like myself back in the day was like, oh, I need to eat 6 meals a day to cover all this stuff. It's like, it's kind of liberating because it's almost like, well, my context now, like I'm working like 50 hours a week. I don't have time to be spending in the kitchen. I don't want to spend my entire Sunday prepping meals for an entire week. So this can be just so much more practical for someone to say, okay, you know what? I can downsize from like 6 meals now down to 3, maybe 4, free up a lot of time, take away a lot of stress, and chances are like adherence and the sustainability, but not just that, like the enjoyability factor is going to go through the roof for this particular individual. So it might have been long-winded, but I think it was super, super useful and helpful for people.